President Corazon Aquino gets tough.
I hereby give notice to all those who may be inclined to exploit the present situation that the sternest measures will be taken against them if they try.
Good evening, I'm Charles Gibson, and this is Nightline. She's fired her defense minister, ordered her entire cabinet to resign, and given communist insurgents a one-week deadline. Can Corazon Aquino save democracy in the Philippines? Among our guests, the Philippine ambassador to the United States.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Charles Gibson.
The reports Monday morning were of a plotted coup in the Philippines. A government spokesman said today it was designed to bump off, those are his words, President Corazon Aquino. But if there was a planned coup, it was done by a sort of Marquess of Queensberry rules. Normally, the leader of an aborted coup would be slapped in jail. Not in the Philippines. Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile, who was said to be leading the rebellion, was called in by Mrs. Aquino and asked to resign. He did, and went home, and now plans to go on vacation. The balance of power in all this may be General Fidel Ramos, who sided with Mrs. Aquino and ordered military forces to stay loyal to her. The full story is coming out in pieces, and the key question is just how strong now is Mrs. Aquino? Here's Jim Laurie.
It took heavy reliance on the military, and especially the loyalty of her Armed Forces Chief of Staff, to do it. But Corazon Aquino put her best foot forward, took her boldest steps yet, and gave her government, she hopes, new hope.
This will give the government a chance to start all over again.
The man who lost his job in all this, Juan Ponce Enrile, defense minister for 16 years, the key figure who in February turned on his old boss, Ferdinand Marcos, leading to Marcos' demise. But also the man who in the past 3 months had become increasingly critical of the Aquino government. Enrile, most felt, was personally ambitious, in speeches harping on the incompetence of some of her ministers, in the cabinet refusing a seat closer to the president, appearing before pro-Marcos rallies, and giving a thumbs down on Aquino's policy of trying to negotiate with the communists. Enrile, a hard-liner, persistently sounding warnings.
The longer we dilly-dally, the more our enemies grow in strength, and the more territories they infiltrate to sow terror among our hapless and helpless people.
This past weekend, Aquino finally had enough. What actually happened to force her to act against Enrile is still somewhat in question. Aquino's loyal military chief of staff, Fidel Ramos, ordered troops into the streets. On reports, there were rebellious acts. Some say mutiny, others say a coup plot by 100 to 200 men loyal to Enrile. Aquino's press spokesman seemed convinced there was a plot.
The game plan was to secure the premises of the Batasang Pambansa, or the legislative building.
But Aquino's newly appointed defense minister seemed less convinced.
I just said we are having an informal, a very informal investigation on an intelligence level, and we will see if there is any truth to this coup plot.
There was no hard evidence, said the new defense chief, just beliefs and rumors. Until there was proof, there'd be no punishment. Some here suggest it was all psychological warfare on the part of Enrile, and some say that though Enrile lost his job, he really didn't lose out. He forced Aquino to do many of the things he wanted her to do in the first place. Aquino later this week will continue her cabinet reshuffle, and sources say at least 2 of the heads to fall will be the very same men who Enrile charged were incompetent, or the military charge were leftists. Further, it's become apparent that a hard line towards the communists is already policy. For months now, communist forces in the Philippines, the New People's Army, have continued to be active. Some say their numbers have grown from 16 to more than 20,000. Negotiations with the political leadership, the so-called National Democratic Front, have been on again, off again, and they've failed so far to lead to a ceasefire. So now, leaning more to the right than the left, Aquino talks tough and sets a deadline.
It is clear that the extreme left has no interest in the peace I have continually offered. I have therefore given the government negotiating panel until the end of the month to produce a ceasefire or terminate all further negotiation.
So Enrile seems to have won all his points. Now in seclusion at his home, he says he's relieved, that he feels he's made a sacrifice and got much of what he sought. His next move may be as an active campaigner. Many expect he will head a new, strong opposition party and will be out on the campaign trail. In February, Aquino will stage a referendum on a new constitution which has been drafted. She sees the plebiscite as a mandate on her leadership. Enrile, it's felt, will try to spoil that vote of confidence, perhaps force her into a new presidential election in which Enrile could be a contender. But with Enrile gone, what Aquino hopes to gain right now is time and confidence. There have been too many political killings in recent months, and Aquino needs peace, especially if anything is to be done about the foreign investments here to perk up this nation's dismal economy. She still must do something about conditions of grinding poverty, which have shown no signs of improvement in her 9 months in office. So Aquino has made a bold move, but she's had to compromise. She has traded flexibility with the communists and some of her old left-of-center political friends for increased military influence and hopefully a little quiet instability. Jim Laurie for Nightline in Manila.
When we come back, we're going to go to Manila to talk with Luis Beltran, editor-in-chief of the biggest daily newspaper in the Philippines. And here in Washington, we'll speak with Emmanuel Pelaez, the Philippine ambassador to the United States and a veteran of 25 years of Philippine politics. Chief of the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the nation's largest newspaper. And here in our Washington bureau is Emmanuel Pelaez, Philippine ambassador to the United States. He was Minister of State under former President Marcos. Ambassador Pelaez, what hard evidence is there that there was a coup about to take place?
I don't think there is any hard evidence uncovered so far. I go by what the new Minister of Defense has said, that they're still investigating.
Well, then on what basis was this done? Was Mrs. Aquino looking, therefore, for some reason to shake up her government, and there may have been a coup in effect discussed, manufactured, or do you really think there was one?
Well, I cannot think that there could be a coup that was so well advertised. And I do not believe that by simply seizing the National Assembly, a coup could have been staged.
So you don't think there was a coup in the works?
Well, there was not a coup. If there was an attempt at a coup, it was a very poor one.
Mr. Beltran, if there wasn't a coup, what was going on?
I think that Ambassador Pelaez and everybody else here in Manila is taking the official line. It's the old Oriental practice of trying to save face for the people who lost the battle. If there wasn't a coup, it seems amazing that Minister Enrile should just walk over and resign. And that several battalions of troops should surround the legislative building known as the Batasan, and that several other battalions would secure Malacanang as well as the major army camps. All of that happened Saturday night up to Sunday morning. And if there was doubt about a coup being staged, I think what we have to see here is a continuing coup. You know, we have already proven, I think beyond a reasonable doubt, that there was a coup intended to unseat Mr. Marcos by basically the same people who are now being accused of having masterminded the current coup.
Mr. Beltran, if the defense minister Enrile was trying to take over the government, and if indeed there was a coup attempted or in the works, why would the government want to save face for him?
Well, I think they're uncertain as to exactly which way Minister Enrile is going to jump now that he has left his position. I think what's happening here is that we're trying to find a solution in which everybody will save face so that there will be no further attempts at a coup d'etat. And I think that's basically what's happening. The government is trying to do that, but, you know, last Saturday night, we were in touch with almost every government official, every military camp, and we even ran an extra on it. And on Saturday night, they were panicking like mad, you know. Now that it's the morning after quarterbacking has begun, there really wasn't too much of a coup, according to them.
Mr. Ambassador, are you trying to save face for the defense minister?
No, of course not. The way this was handled was there were attempts, there were reports in Cebu that certain soldiers were gathering in order to protest some acts of the Aquino government. And there were reports that some men identified with the security force of Mr. Enrile had ordered troops to come to Manila. Now, this led the Chief of Staff to take preventive action.
That's General Ramos you're talking
about?
That's
General Ramos.
Yes.
Now, my doubt about this being a serious coup was that it was so clumsy. It was known by everybody. Now, with respect to Mr. Enrile, the next morning, Mrs. Aquino called for the members of her cabinet and asked for their resignation. Mr. Enrile was not with the first batch, but he was later called when the others agreed to resign. Mr. Enrile was at his house, and he went to see the president. And the president talked to him and told him that she was not unmindful of his service during the revolution, and she wanted to work with him. But because of their difference in perspectives, there was destabilization and the situation could not go on. And she asked for his resignation. And according to her, he took it very well.
Well, it was all done in certainly a very civilized fashion. Mr. Beltran, I used the term Marquess of Queensberry rules earlier. That may be too much of an Americanism, but it was done in a very civilized fashion. Normally, people who are attempting coups are thrown in jail. And yet Mr. Enrile seems to be in a very comfortable situation at the moment.
Well, I think basically what happened was that there was a plan, or there was a coup about to be mounted, and the armed forces just beat them to it. Because, you know, we're a very open society. You know, we even talk about our coups in coffee shops and publicly, and that's why there was so much advertising about it. But that doesn't make it any less deadly. Well, and right now, I understand what they're trying to do is determine if there was a ground for treasonable acts.
In talking about it so openly, wasn't he, in effect, inviting her to take countermeasures?
Well, I think that there was a point about a week or 2 weeks ago when the people supporting Minister Enrile believed that the president was so helpless that she could neither fire him or ask him to resign. In fact, I have first-hand information to the effect that they did not know in the Malacanang what they would do suppose if they fired him and then he refused to vacate his office. So this was a very convenient excuse for, well, asking him to resign.
Mr. Ambassador, I know you want to break in. We'll come back to you in a moment, and I want to talk about whether Mrs. Aquino comes out of this stronger, and also talk about the U.S. role in all of this, and we'll do that when we come back. We're going to be joined by one of the leading supporters of the Aquino regime on Capitol Hill, Congressman Stephen Solars of New York. Solars of New York. Congressman Solars is chairman of the Asian and Pacific Affairs Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he was an outspoken critic of former Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. Congressman, much has been made of the role in all of this of General Ramos, the military chief of staff. He, on Saturday night, ordered the military to stay with Mrs. Aquino. If he had gone the other way, do you think there could have been a successful coup?
I don't think in the final analysis, Charlie, that a coup would have succeeded even if it had enjoyed the cooperation of General Ramos, which it obviously did not. At the end of the day, I think the Filipino people who continue to overwhelmingly support Mrs. Aquino would have risen up in order to prevent the coup from succeeding in the same way that they rose up in February in order to support those who were attempting to bring down the Marcos regime.
But in February, the military had gone, or much of the military went, with Ramos and Enrile. In this instance, could they have, in effect, set the military up in opposition to the government?
I don't think the Philippine military are prepared to fire on their own people. If the Filipino people had come out on the streets by the hundreds of thousands, as I expect they would have done, were there a challenge to the government of Mrs. Aquino, I suspect that the military would have backed down. Fortunately, it never came to pass. But in the final analysis, I believe that it was the fact that Mrs. Aquino enjoys the overwhelming support of the Filipino people, which helped influence the decision of the military leadership to support her in this moment of crisis.
I take it you think she comes out of this stronger?
I think that she has enormously strengthened her position. I only wish that President Reagan dealt with the crisis in his government with the same finesse and dispatch that she demonstrated in dealing with the crisis in her government.
Mr. Beltran, do you think she comes out of this stronger, given the fact that she had to concede an awful lot of the points that Defense Minister Relay was pushing?
I think I dispute the point raised by Congressman Solers to the effect that even if the General Ramos had joined the plotters, the military couldn't have overthrown her. I think one of the realities that we have to live with here is the fact that if the military decides to institute a coup d'etat, they can take the seat of government and probably capture President Aquino's entire administration in a matter of one day or one night. But the fact of the matter is that the equation that they have to study is the fact that they cannot hold it for long. I think this has been very clear from the very beginning. The military can take over, but her personal popularity with the people would overwhelm them by millions.
I'm afraid, Mr. Beltran, in mid-statement, we lost the satellite from Manila. At least I gather that's what happened. I hope that's not the case. We'll try to get it back. But if we did lose the satellite, Mr. Ambassador, he was making the point that if the military had gone against Mrs. Aquino, that temporarily they could have taken over the government. Do you agree with that?
Temporarily is correct. He agrees with Steve Solers.
Yes.
They couldn't hold the government because the people were overwhelmingly for President Aquino.
In other words, that the military would only be in the short run successful.
Certainly. And given the composition of the military today, considering that most of the generals now are appointed by Mrs. Aquino, considering that she has cleaned up the military and that she has now, with the help of the Chief of Staff, professionalized the military, they will not go against Mrs. Aquino.
But let me come back to the point that I started to raise with Mr. Beltran, and I understand we now have the satellite back. And let me ask both the ambassador and Mr. Beltran this. If this situation arose with the military, she has already conceded a great number of the points that the defense minister was bringing forth, was she not? I mean, does she come out stronger given the fact that she has conceded that the communists will have to sign a ceasefire by Sunday or the military, in effect, will be unleashed?
Well, she would have made the same decision whether the military had urged her to do so or not, because she herself was beginning to doubt the sincerity of the communists, because they had broken off the talk several times. And I would say that in her revamp of the cabinet, whether the military had asked for the revamp or not, she would have done so, because she feels that the people want her to revamp her cabinet.
Mr. Beltran?
I think that, well, there was one point that Jim Laurie raised, which I dispute. The fact that Minister Enrile has won so much, the only thing he lost is his position. I think, well, I'm relatively well informed about what's happening inside the administration.
We'll concede that.
And it is my perception that, the major target of the military, with whom they wanted removed, is not going to be removed from the government. That's Executive Secretary Joker Arroyo. The people who are being removed are actually being removed because of the clamor within the sectors that they covered: labor, local governments, the other sectors in which graft and corruption have been raised. So there is really no yielding to the military pressure at this point. I think one thing that perhaps we should all realize is the fact that although the military tends to get divorced from the rest of Philippine society, they're Filipinos just like all of us here. The only difference is that they wear the uniform. I think if 70% of the Filipino people, or 80%, support Mrs. Aquino, there is about 70 to 80% of the military supporting her also, without being ordered to do so. In fact, in the course of the so-called weekend coup, General Ramos, I think, was even surprised because he called every regional unit commander just to make sure that they were loyal. And to a man, they gave their loyalty. And I don't think all of that is just due to Ramos alone.
All right, there's one name we haven't mentioned. That is Ferdinand Marcos. I want to ask about him when we continue our discussion in a moment. Beltran, Ambassador Emmanuel Pelaez, and Congressman Stephen Solars. Congressman, did Ferdinand Marcos have any role in this?
I don't know, Charlie. It wouldn't surprise me if he was attempting from the distance of Honolulu to influence events in Manila, but we have no concrete evidence to suggest that he was intimately involved in the events of the last 48 hours.
There were reports that 150 to 200 military officers may have been involved in whatever happened. only the defense minister in relay has been removed. Those other 150 to 200 presumably are still in place. Can we assume that things are now stable, given the fact that there probably is a severe body of opposition within the military? Do you think things are now stable in that country?
I very much hope that Mrs. Aquino and the new Minister of Defense will take whatever steps need to be taken in order to remove from positions of responsibility within the military any officers who may have been involved in this presumptive coup. But let me also say, Charlie, that just as the Filipino people set the standard for how to conduct the revolution in February, they appear to have set the standard for how to crush a coup in November. It was done in the first case peacefully, and in the second case in a very civilized fashion. As Ambassador Pelaez has said, it is the Filipino way. And I am convinced that Mrs. Aquino, who is a woman who has a steel fist inside of a velvet glove, will take the kind of steps which are necessary
about a
to
Klan.
make it.
We've certainly had our share of threats. We've had our office.
Warlords, many of them still loyal to Ferdinand Marcos. A communist insurgency that's continued to fight government troops. A crippled economy.
Execute its just law. Do justice
and
to every man.
The continuing threat that Ferdinand Marcos may come home.
And consecrate myself. To the service of the nation. To the service of the nation. So
Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel in Los Angeles, and this is Nightline. On this, her 100th day in office, we'll ask her.
Was that I could not promise.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Los Angeles, Ted Koppel.
There's nothing magic about the first 100 days of a new administration. No particular reason for believing that evils can be uprooted, new policies implemented in just a little more than 3 months. Certainly someone knows how and when the tradition of evaluating a new government after 100 days began. We don't. But it's as good a pretext as any for looking in once again on the Philippines, where so many things changed so quickly during late February of this year. For the moment, Corazon Aquino can and does argue that she cannot be expected to have changed in 100 days what Ferdinand Marcos did in 20 years. It's a logical argument, but in politics, logic doesn't always prevail. As Jim Laurie reports, revolutions are expected to produce revolutionary results.
Filipinos are celebrating something more than their annual religious fiestas this year. They're celebrating the end of an unpopular government, the fading signs of former President Marcos, the success of their bloodless revolution. Several times each day, government TV repeats this film, reliving the 4 days of February. But 100 days after the revolution, the euphoria is fading. The government of Cory Aquino is facing a series of problems which may be more challenging than getting rid of Ferdinand Marcos himself. Baby Carol Ughayan is suffering acute malnutrition. In 100 days, she's made little progress, has gained no weight. In 100 days, more than 40 children here at this hospital have died of malnutrition. They are the children of the island of Negros, one of the Philippine islands where the Aquino government is facing its most pressing task.
Well, the economy we have inherited from the last administration is one where 70% of the population live below poverty line.
In Negros, the poorest are sugar workers, peasants still trapped in a feudal system that is now crumbling. After 100 days, workers like Marlene Vista look to their new president.
She will give land to be planted, for example, rice, corn, root crops, so that the workers can survive.
So far, sweeping land reform is not part of the Aquino program, though the president says the poor are her first priority. Their expectations are not easily met.
You take over a town with so much idealism and so much expectations of the people from you, and you can't move around pretty much because there's no money.
At age 28, Rowena Guanzon is Cory Aquino's newly appointed mayor in Cadiz, a coastal town in northern Negros. Like the national treasury, the town of Cadiz is virtually bankrupt. The mayor wants to provide running water and a playground in this shanty town.
And then maybe we'll get donations from companies like Coca-Cola to put up the basketball boards.
Lack of money is not the mayor's only problem.
This is Cadiz Radio, the station that shares because we care.
15 hours a day, this radio station, the only one in the northern part of the island, is dedicated to denouncing the Aquino government. The station owner is Armando Gustillo, governor of this region under Marcos.
If you talk legally, then Mr. Marcos is still the legal president of the Philippines.
Around here, they call Gustillo a warlord. He controlled local politics and much of the economy here for 40 years. He claims to have disbanded his private army, but on the grounds of his heavily guarded compound on station DY Armando Gustillo, he stops just short of calling for revolt.
Should the people no longer have trust in a revolutionary government, such a government will open itself to a counter-revolution.
I think Mr. Gustillo is very much a threat. He continues to defy the government of Cory Aquino.
So far, Aquino's people have done nothing to stop his broadcasts.
We have freedom of speech and expression in this country, especially now.
There are a lot of Marcos loyalists. You cannot deny that. There are many Marcos loyalists.
But if the Marcos men are trouble for Aquino, these people are a more serious threat. Communist insurgents whom Cory Aquino wants to disarm. For 2 months now, she's been trying to start negotiations. There are an estimated 16,000 guerrillas nationwide and many more sympathizers.
In the hinterlands, you can see you can feel the presence of this sympathy.
Wealthy businessman Borgi Gallardo should know. His younger brother joined the New People's Army 14 years ago.
And that's him, right there in the blue shirt with this group.
Macau Gallardo is an NPA political officer hiding in the Negros Mountains.
When, right after the 4-day revolution, I wrote him a very long letter and I told him, look, you know, this is the opportunity for change. I'm not asking you to surrender. What I'm doing is I'm asking you to talk to the new leadership.
Macau last week sent down this tape-recorded reply.
As far as we are concerned, laying down of arms or surrender, out of question.
Borgi Gallardo, a firm believer in free market democracy, feels the only way to bring his brother out of the hills is to change the social conditions here.
I'm saying that the situation is serious, it's urgent, and it's critical, and we've got to do something about it pretty fast before our time runs out.
After 100 days, Cory Aquino is still popular. No one doubts her personal sincerity. In the face of massive problems, she urges patience, but there is no holding back competing demands and growing expectations.
Because many people already, their patience is running out. They're choosing other alternatives.
She has failed in our economic recovery. She has failed in making her government politically stable.
We cannot eat 3 times a day now because we are out of jobs and our children now is suffering hunger. That's what I cannot. That's what I like to Mrs. Cory Aquino, that she will listen our problem here in this village.
Cory Aquino will have to listen to a lot of problems and solve more of them if her government is to last. Jim Laurie for Nightline in the Philippines.
When we come back, I'll be talking to the President of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino. In Manila, the President of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino. President Aquino, the biggest difference between what you expected and what you have found over the last 100 days?
Well, not really that big a difference, Ted. What I was always telling the Filipino people, even during the campaign, was that I could not promise miracles.
You better than anyone must know what happens in the wake of a revolution. People expect, as I said at the beginning of this program, revolutionary changes. There haven't really been revolutionary changes, have there?
Well, maybe because our revolution was different from other revolutions. Ours was a peaceful and bloodless revolution, and perhaps this is the difference. In other revolutions, it is a bloody confrontation, and perhaps more changes are effected that way. But I have always believed in nonviolence. I have always believed in peaceful changes, even if these do take much longer.
People expected, and I think you know that because you also promised that there would be some kind of justice. Now, you allowed people to infer whatever they wanted to, but I know that a lot of people who were badly treated by the Marcos regime expected that justice would mean that a lot of people in the army, a lot of people who had been in the Marcos government might even be put on trial. Has any of that happened?
Already there are investigations taking place, and we have a commission on human rights, which is headed by former Senator Jose Diokno. And in the military, there is also a committee looking into the graft and corruption among some of the officers in the armed forces.
You and I talked shortly after you took power about how high such things might reach and of the dilemma that you would face, because many of the people who helped bring you into power might indeed themselves become the targets of such court proceedings or tribunal proceedings. I realize you've stressed the independence of this commission, but do you have any sense how high up this is likely to reach?
Well, I understand in the military that there are, well, 2 generals were mentioned as being investigated as to possible involvement or illegal accumulation of wealth. And I guess it would be some of the lower ranking where human rights violations would be looked into, because actually I don't meet with Senator Jose Diokno that often. As I said, he has formed his commission, and they are taking care of all of these problems.
As soon as you came into power, you extended the hand of friendship to some of the communist guerrillas. You said if you will lay down your arms, then you can become a part of the society again as long as you renounce violence. You have to be somewhat disappointed at the lack of reaction that there has been.
Well, Ted, I'd like you to be the first to know that finally we have received word from the top leadership of the Communist Party, and they have named one of their negotiators. We in the government are also prepared to name our negotiators. And so finally, now that we have established formal contact with them, the negotiations will be soon to start. And from these talks, we will be able to hopefully declare a ceasefire. And, well, I'd much rather not elaborate. I will let the negotiations go on first, and from there we will be able to find out exactly what they are prepared to offer us.
President Aquino, before we take a break, your military leadership, from your defense minister on down, has always been more cynical about the prospect of a ceasefire with the communists than you have been. Are you sure that they are prepared to go forward with a ceasefire, assuming, of course, that the negotiations are fruitful?
Yes, because in fact, I did, you know, I do confer with both Minister Enrile and General Ramos, and they are, of course, also very eager to have peace, and they would also very much like to have a ceasefire. And they agree with me that we should exhaust all peaceful efforts before we resort to force.
Any kind of time limit that you're placing on these negotiations? Does anything have to be achieved within a certain period of time, or are you prepared to let them be open-ended?
Oh, the sooner we can get these peace talks going, and the sooner we can declare a ceasefire, like within not longer than 6 months anyway.
You're talking about 6 months for the whole process?
For the declaration of ceasefire, yes.
All right, President Aquino, when we come back, I'd like to talk to you about your predecessor. He has been rather active over the last few weeks. There's even talk that he'd like to come back to the Philippines. We'll raise that question when we return, which we will do in just a moment. Presidential Palace in Manila, the President of the Philippines, Corazon Aquino. President Aquino, talk to us for a moment about Ferdinand Marcos. He has been talking about returning to the Philippines. He puts it in fairly undramatic terms. He wants to come back and live like a peasant. I know you don't believe that. I heard you tell David Hartman that on Good Morning America. But what does he represent? Is he still a threat?
I don't think so, but I would like to remind him that he owes this to the Filipino people to stay away, because it is to the greater interest of the Filipino people that Mr. Marcos stay in the United States for the time being.
You know, you keep saying that, and I keep hearing that subtle point, for the time being, and you are thereby suggesting that the day may come when you'd be willing to let him come back. What is it? Time has to pass, or you have to be able to consolidate your hold, or a certain series of events has to take place? What is required before he can come back?
Well, first of all, Ted, as you probably know, we went through well, a really very delicate and a very divisive elections in February. And after that, we did have the four-day revolution. And even now, some of the passions are still high, and it would not be good for the country to bring somebody like Mr. Marcos back, because my supporters, or maybe not only my supporters, but the great majority of the Filipino people still remember and can see all the damage that Mr. Marcos has done to our country. So it would only lead to more divisiveness if he came back at this time.
How much of a nuisance can he still be to you? Does he represent any kind of a threat? In other words, when you talk about him, you're also, of course, talking about some of his supporters who are still quite vocal in their support of him and in their opposition to you. Do they concern you? Do they worry you? Do you still think that there is the possibility of violence?
Well, first of all, I realize Mr. Marcos still has all that money. He still has some organization left, plus some of his warlords still continue to possess their firearms. They have not surrendered them to the military, so we do have those problems. And especially now, where we are in an economic crisis, Mr. Marcos, with all of his money, could really create some disturbance here.
President Aquino, we saw in the report that Jim Laurie did just a few moments ago, one of those warlords who is still quite adamant in his opposition to you and in his support of President Marcos. Why don't you simply order the military in to take over?
Well, the military, in fact, has been going out and getting the firearms of these warlords. It's, again, they are not resorting to violence. They are not using force right away. They are doing this through peaceful ways, and so that does take longer. But a number of warlords have already been, have already surrendered their firearms. But Mr. Gustillo apparently is still holding on to some of his.
Talk to us for a couple of minutes, if you would, about what you have discovered and what your people have discovered over the last 100 days about the Marcos financial empire. What have you learned?
Well, while it is true that before the February Revolution, we all believe that, Mr. Marcos had really robbed our country of its wealth, we never knew the extent of it until now, and even to this day, there are still discoveries being made of just how much money and how many properties he has acquired, not only in our country, but of course throughout the entire world. And it becomes clearer now to our people why our country is really in such a sad economic condition, because of what Mr. Marcos and his cronies have done to our country's wealth.
Are you able to attach any numbers to what you're talking about there? Have you reached a bottom line yet? I mean, have you done the addition? Are we talking about hundreds of millions? Are we talking about billions of dollars? Because, I mean, Marcos, as you know, claims poverty. He says he doesn't have anything.
Well, anywhere between $5 and $10 billion. And as each day goes by, we are learning and finding out more about Mr. Marcos's hidden wealth.
All right, President Aquino, we're going to take a short break again. When we come back, I'd like to talk to you about the economy of the Philippines and how you see the future of that economy developing. We'll be back with President Aquino in just a moment. Aquino of the Philippines. Madam President, how are things going with you in the United States? I know your representatives have asked for a lot of help, and I gather are not receiving quite as much as you'd like. How serious is that?
Well, Ted, I was very happy to learn today that Mr. Schultz, Secretary Schultz has encouraged private investors in the United States to come into the Philippines. So certainly that will be a very big help. And Secretary Schultz did promise that the American government would be extending us assistance. So I am grateful for that, but at the same time, I continue to remind our people that we have to help ourselves if we want other countries to help us.
Do you feel any differently about the U.S. bases in the Philippines than you did 3 or 4 months ago?
No, Ted. The answer is still the same. As I've said, I will respect the RP-US military bases agreement until 1991, and I am keeping my options open.
Permit me a rather trivial personal question, if I may. You're still not really living in the palace there, are you? Why not?
I could not live in such an extravagant and lavish palace such as this when our people are suffering so much.
Are you still able to maintain as much of a family life as you did before you became president?
Well, no, but we do try to make time for the family, and at least once a week we either have lunch together or dinner together so that we can keep up with one another's activities.
Well, President Aquino, it's a great pleasure talking to you again. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Ted. It's always a privilege to appear on your program.
Thank you. Good night. That's our broadcast for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Los Angeles.
The man who led the uprising 16 days ago against Mrs. Aquino's government. Diane Sawyer found him.
Not a repeat. It's a report by Diane Sawyer on a man on the run. The man they call the Rambo of the Philippines. President Aquino calls him a murderer and a traitor. Since he led an uprising 16 days ago, he's been in hiding. Diane Sawyer went to the Philippines to look for him and found him.
For 24 hours on August 28th, this was the scene in the streets of Manila. And this is the man who was leading the soldiers' rebellion, the legendary Colonel Gregorio Honasan, a rakish Philippine national hero known as Gringo. By the time a government counter-assault ended Honasan's mutiny, 53 people had been killed, 300 wounded, some of them civilians, including President Aquino's son. The first order given was that Honasan be shot on sight. Later, the order was softened to capture him alive. Honasan had become a hunted man. And the way we got to him is something of a story in itself. After several secret meetings with rebel intermediaries, it was arranged that a van would pick us up before dawn. When it arrived, 2 men wearing masks ordered us to get in and lie face down, which is how we stayed for about an hour until the van stopped and we were blindfolded and led one by one up a narrow stairs into a small attic room. Within minutes, Gringo Honasan appeared. He set no ground rules and did not, as rumored, ask for money. He said he agreed to this meeting with us and Newsweek's Melinda Liu because of false stories like the one that he's a Muslim fanatic and because of his fear that Filipino journalists would be censored. Are you scared?
Well, who wouldn't be? Nobody wants to be the object of a nationwide manhunt. Nobody wants to be the victim of one-sided propaganda.
Are you convinced there really is a manhunt? Do you think they really don't know where you are?
Some units and some commanders, some officers who want to take advantage of the opportunity to increase their stock value are actively participating in it. But I think the majority of law enforcement and military personnel are half-hearted about the effort.
If the search for Honasan is half-hearted, it may be because in the Philippines, he's a kind of Ollie North, a combination matinee idol and brash adventurer, who parachutes from planes with a python in his pocket, and also charms the businessmen at the Rotary Club. He's a soldier's soldier who says his men would follow him anywhere, even into the streets. Tell me, how many? They said there were 1,000 to 1,300 on August the 28th. Are they close?
No.
Many more?
More.
Thousands and thousands more?
Well, I won't be that presumptuous again and say that we're thousands or hordes, but it's a reasonable force.
And are they out there now waiting for another phase? Is there another phase that you have planned?
They're out there now with their sentiments, their sympathies, waiting for another effort.
And the men who are out there for Honasan include some of the Army's best and brightest. Many of the officers are, like him, top graduates of the military academy, the Philippine West Point. His supporters have long been openly critical of Cory Aquino and her military chief, Fidel Ramos, saying they are dangerously incompetent and too weak to run the country. The soldiers say corruption is as bad as it was under Marcos. And while Aquino offers amnesty to the communist rebels, she gives the Army no direction and no support. You really think Cory Aquino is letting this country eventually go to the communists? You really believe that?
By omission, by wrong advice, but definitely I have a very strong feeling that she is not completely in control, which to me is very essential for management.
Is part of your agenda a commitment to a different kind of warfare against the communists?
Yes.
To a tougher, more active, concerted?
Well, tougher is still relative. We want a very clear national security policy.
And if the colonel sounds a lot like this man, it's no coincidence. One Ponce Enrile, former defense minister, Aquino's arch rival, used to be Honasan's boss, even calling the colonel's group "my boys." Together, they opposed Marcos at the time of the revolution and expected Aquino to make the armed forces an equal partner after Marcos fell. But Honasan says even as Aquino gave out medals, she still blamed the military for the murder of her husband. And even as he shook her hand, he simmered with resentment and decided that something drastic had to be done.
People, both in government and in the military, have been lying to each other and telling everybody that everything is okay, everything is under control, we have no problems. We have problems. Everything is not under control.
And he says that's why on August 28th, his men surrounded the presidential palace, Malacanang. He says it wasn't really a military coup, but a kind of stunt designed to wake people up. Wait a minute, you're saying this was just to be a symbolic demonstration,
Yes.
just a gathering in the street of the military?
Yes, a gathering in the street of the military, some acoustic effects.
Acoustic effects, what
Yes.
you mean, shooting over people's heads?
Yes.
To scare them?
Not to scare them, but to catch their attention.
But this was quite a length to go to make a public political point, a symbolic point.
If you consider the cultural environment, especially if you consider the nature of Filipinos, you cannot talk to them in conventional terms.
So this was just an unconventional way of getting their attention?
Yes, and conveying a message and generating awareness.
Did Minister Enrile know what you were doing?
No.
Not at all?
No.
No one believes that. No one can believe that.
Yes.
He knew
generally, didn't we?
We have to give him a little credit for intelligence. The man is very perceptive. Don't.
If he'd said, no, don't do it, would you have stopped?
It had gone beyond what he thought and what we thought. We moved because we felt very strongly, with enough basis, that it was time to deliver a message.
Whatever message was intended, this message was delivered.
The aim of the rebels was clearly to kill the president and her family.
She thought you were trying to kill her and her family. They were on their knees praying inside the palace.
On their knees praying?
That's what their daughter has said.
I was also on my knees praying for some form of divine intervention when I decided to get involved in this effort. I was telling whoever was listening, of course I was alone physically, that if something is wrong with the moral basis for all this, then I should have an accident.
Then let you be killed before it happens.
Yes, let me suffer a sprain while jogging.
So you're saying it's a question of whose side God is on?
Yes, I'm not deeply religious, but I believe in divine intervention. It has happened too many times already.
Did you not foresee that something like this could happen?
Yes, that was part of the risk we took.
So you were willing to risk the deaths even of civilians?
Well,
to make this
in a very indirect sort of way, I told them not to fire at civilians, not to fire at fellow soldiers. The president is not the issue here or the target. It is politically untenable for us to either kill her, any member of her family, hold her hostage, or hold Malacanang. But we had the force to do it.
Honasan admits he intended to hold the military bases until he forced Cory Aquino to accept a kind of junta of political and military professionals. He said this committee would help run the country until she learned how, if she ever learned. And he seems a little surprised she didn't appreciate his management advice.
I never thought she could take it so personally. And,
but you tend to take things personally when you're in a palace and your military surrounds it and cuts off your exit and your son is trying to get in.
Yes, but that is the burden of being president. Mrs. Aquino cannot anymore assume the role of housewife, widow. She has to rise above her shortcomings, her strengths. She has to rise above personalities. Because that is the only way we can address the issue confronting the Republic right now, which is not ideology, not politics, it's survival.
But the Aquino government says Honasan is less interested in the country's survival than his own political ambition. When we told General Ramos, the chief of staff, about our interview, he said, for more than a year, Honasan has been diverting weapons from our soldiers into a personal stockpile. He doesn't want democracy. He must be tried for committing crimes against our people. Honasan says he and his men will be back for another round, though not a round like August 28th.
But you're saying whatever happens in the next few months, you will do nothing to do that would endanger civilian lives, like happened on August 28th?
Yes.
That you will not engage in urban warfare, in terrorism, which people have talked about, in bombing of installations?
Yes.
But there will be something else?
It will be something else, a more non-confrontational way of doing it.
I don't know what the options are.
Well, these are tactical options, so I think you should also give us credit for some imagination.
You know, the rest of the world looked at this country and said they made it. They made it from a dictatorship to a democracy. And the next thing you know, there are 5 coup attempts, apparently, against Mrs. Aquino, and one on August 28th that nearly succeeded. And to the rest of the world, this looks like fascism.
Which is, again, even to the rest of the world, a label that people who do not understand internal issues are fond of making.
But to the outside world, who look at this and say, he's a Rambo gone amok. He's a macho man who just didn't keep control of himself. What do you say to them?
Well, I say to them, you can try being a Filipino for maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, and then I'll give you a chance to say your piece again. And then that's the only time you can even start thinking and feeling like a Filipino, and then maybe in a more credible sort of way, evaluating what we as a people are going through. You cannot be 10,000 miles away and say, he's a Rambo ganman. Who is Rambo? Rambo is an American.
And at one point during our visit to his hideout, before we were blindfolded and led back to the van, we heard a sound overhead that reminded us what it must be like to be Gringo Hanasa these days.
What is that?
I think that's a helicopter. Unless they have a way of...
Yours or theirs?
I think ours.
Yours? You're being watched that carefully?
Yes.
Protected that carefully?
No, I'm just kidding about being ours. I think the pilot is ours, but the helicopter is not yet ours.
Assassinations is in Canada tonight. Rodolfo Pacificador showed up across the border tonight after an immigration hearing in Buffalo earlier today. His attorney, John Condon, is declining to comment on the events that led to his client's return to Canada. Pacificador was arrested in September at the Rainbow Bridge after requesting political asylum across the border. Fire investigators say arson is the cause of...
Independence and poverty. The military threatens her on the right and the communists on the left. The last few days have been typically trying. 2 American servicemen and a Filipino who had served in the United States Air Force were shot to death near the American-leased Clark Air Base last Wednesday, and nobody knows whether the bullets came from the left or from the right. Richard Wagner is in the Philippines, where he has been covering President Aquino's struggle day by day. He now reports our Sunday morning cover story.
Corazon Aquino was swept into office on the wave of a phenomenon called people power.
To the service of the nation.
So help me God.
So help me God.
She began her 6-year term in a mood of national euphoria. The honeymoon, however, did not last long.
The problems are really enormous, and I think this is the only time in our history when a president is embattled on both sides, getting in from the extreme left and from the ultra-right. The immediate problem, as I would refer to, is the rebels from the military, because what happened on August 28th in the attempted coup really caused a lot of damage.
August 28th marked the 5th time troops from the army of which Mrs. Aquino is commander-in-chief have tried to overthrow her government. Mrs. Aquino's supporters say her ability to carry on in the face of adversity is proof that she is growing in the job, that she is indeed presidential.
The question you all really want to ask is, can she hack it? Isn't she weak? Henceforth, I shall rule directly as president. To the ad hoc committees and commissions created to inform me on their special areas, I now add one more. An action committee with a single member, me.
She is in charge, she is in control, she is the president, she is the commander-in-chief.
Her spokesman, Teodoro Benigno, says the one-time housewife is a full-time leader.
Any other person who would have been exposed to the same pressures, the same burdens of state, numbers of mutinies, coups, and so on and so forth, not to mention a communist insurgency and a full-blown economic crisis, would probably have collapsed like Humpty Dumpty.
Your Excellency.
Far from collapsing, Cory Aquino has tackled head-on what she considers her #1 problem, the Army. Under the martial law government of Ferdinand Marcos, the Army enjoyed special privileges. The reason Mrs. Aquino has enemies in the Army is that she is restoring it to its traditional role.
I know there will always be ambition. Those who are desperate to retrieve their lost privileges will do what they can. I will do what I must to stop them.
West Point-trained General Fidel Ramos is Armed Forces Chief of Staff.
Since the Cory government came into power, the basic approach to the development of the armed forces is to make it an armed forces of the people and to provide for the people's security instead of the security of one family or the cronies of one family.
Not everyone here shares Mrs. Aquino's order of priorities. Many would like to see her focus on wiping out the communist insurgency. Starting in 1969 with just a handful of men, the communist insurgency has grown into an armed force numbering 23,000. Her vice president and foreign minister, Salvador Laurel, resigned at the latter post in protest when it became evident she did not intend to launch a full-scale military offensive against the New People's Army.
I was for fighting it all out, like a real all-out war effort. In fact, I likened it to a fire. I said our house is on fire, and we must use all the available water to put out the fire. And I said I cannot agree with anyone who'd like to water the plants.
Criticism like that from inside and outside her government is something Mrs. Aquino has learned to deal with as she approaches 2 years in office.
Oh, of course, I'm only human, and although it doesn't hurt as much, I guess initially, like say, the first 6 months or even the first year, then one does get to be a little sensitive or very sensitive. Then one realizes that this is part of the job.
Cory Aquino has set for herself the intimidating task of unifying this extremely diverse country. There are 57 million Filipinos living in a nation made up of more than 7,000 islands. There are 11 distinct racial and cultural groups, each with its own language. And this is a terribly poor country. Mrs. Aquino is striving to revive an economy which collapsed under the corruption and mismanagement of Ferdinand Marcos. She knows it will take time.
I guess people expect many things. You know, when a change comes about, then from a dictatorship to a democracy, then I suppose it's only normal or natural for people to expect a great many improvements. But I hope they will be more patient. I think they are. They understand that the problems are really enormous.
It takes countries the size of the Philippines some time to kind of turn themselves around.
Stephen Bosworth was U.S. ambassador to the Philippines when she became president.
It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to turn around a medium-sized corporation in the American economy. And to turn around a country of 57 million people is an awesome task.
The United States has a special stake in the Aquino government, fighting off any further coup attempts and remaining in power until 1992. The U.S.'s two most important military bases in the Far East, Clark Field and Subic Bay Naval Station, are in the Philippines. The leases on both run out in 1991, and observers believe extensions can be successfully negotiated with an Aquino administration. Nicholas Platt is the current U.S. ambassador here.
There's a certain amount of emotion that's attached to this issue. it's quite understandable. But when you cut through the emotion and you sit down and you work out, you know, what's in it for each country, I think that the results are persuasive.
So, the world watches as the housewife-turned-president strives to restore democracy to her country. There are some here who think she's the only person who can do it.
I will even say that if something happens to her tonight or tomorrow, by death, by accident, or by incapacity, I have a very, very strong feeling, a very sick feeling in my stomach that things, as a matter of fact, might just go into pieces.
If it is not yet my time, then nobody can do me any harm, and I can just do as I believe I should. And so I do not allow myself to worry about whether I will survive through the day, but the more important thing for me is to be able to do as much as I can for that day, and do it so that it will help to improve the lives of our people.
Makita